The thing that sort of made this a desperate search for me was that about a year ago, I simply couldn't get out of bed. I mean, I would go to work and I would collapse, but I have teenage boys and I couldn't take care of them. And there seemed to be no reason. And the weight was just packing on.
Even though it's thought to be very rare, in my practice, I've actually seen other cases like this. So it can't be that it's 1 in a million, because I haven't seen that many patients. But Andrea ended up with treatment for it where she actually had to have surgery to remove the area of her adrenal gland that was secreting the extra cortisol. And I've had other patients too where that happened, where they had Cushing's and had to have that nodule removed from their adrenal gland or a whole adrenal gland removed. So it can't be as rare. And I think that's why we're here trying to tell the story, is about being suspicious of things that don't add up metabolically and going that extra step to look further, and why that's just so important.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Hi.
All right, on the show this week, we're talking about Cushing's syndrome. We're going to define what it is, how it's kind of a rare disease, but it has a lot to do with metabolism. And also joining us is Andrea, a patient of Dr. Cooper. Andrea, great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So we were joking before we hit the record button that your name is actually the fancy version of Andrea's name. Okay, I think we should start, Dr. Cooper, by defining what Cushing's syndrome is.
Well, Cushing's syndrome, it really encompasses a lot of different conditions that cause the cortisol level to be abnormally elevated. Cortisol, as you know, we've talked about before, is a stress hormone. So the most common cause of cortisol being elevated is stress, really. People just that are under a lot of stress. But this would be a situation where it's abnormally elevated and doesn't seem to be related to stress. And there are other biological things that start to occur that play into our metabolic syndrome type picture, where you'll see things like glucose elevation, cholesterol, might even see certain effects that would happen if someone is taking actually a steroid, because cortisol is a steroid, is like prednisone, basically. So you could see bone loss, things like that. So it's just one of the things to think about when you see people that have unexplained weight gain or really aggressive or progressive prediabetes, insulin resistance, and weight gain in spite of the normal treatments that seem to have either an elevated cortisol or levels of other hormones that indicate abnormal cortisol production.
Yeah, too much cortisol, we've talked about before, really kind of sabotages the whole metabolic system. Dr. Cooper, explain, if you would, refresh us on how it does that.
Well, one of the things that happens is there's part of the metabolic pathway in the brain, in the pituitary gland. It's called the POMC pathway. And in that pathway, we make a hormone called ACTH, which is actually a stimulator of cortisol. But ACTH is also a stimulator of one of the most important metabolic hormones, which is called melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And that hormone, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, is responsible for our weight regulation and insulin regulation. So one of the problems in Cushing's is that if the cortisol levels go up real high, abnormally high, there's a feedback, just like other hormone systems in our body. The cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal gland, feeds back and tells our pituitary gland, hey, here's all the cortisol. So normally the pituitary gland would respond by suppressing the output of that hormone ACTH so that our cortisol levels can come back down. But as it does, that will then be weakening your metabolic, system as a result. And so the metabolism pays a price for these elevated cortisol levels. And so you end up with higher appetite and worse insulin balancing with your glucose levels, possibly insulin resistance and increasing glucose, increasing weight gain.
What would cause that?
Well, as I said, the most common cause is high stress and lack of sleep, sleep apnea, just to, causing elevated cortisol levels just as a stress part of the stress response. And that's how stress aggravates our metabolism, really, by weakening that POMC pathway, feeding back and limiting our ACTH production, which is critical for our important melanocyte stimulating hormone to function. So stress would be the most common cause, but there can be other causes. There can be also in Cushing's, what Cushing's is abnormal cortisol production. The most common cause of that is that the pituitary gland is putting out a lot of ACTH, extra ACTH, and that's stimulating high cortisol. And in spite of that, the ACTH doesn't turn off. And so that is a different type of a problem, but that is the most common kind of form of Cushing's that we see, that it's originating from the pituitary gland. But Andrea's type of disease was not that most common type. Hers was one where it was originating from the adrenal gland itself, where there were just independent kind of rogue areas of the adrenal gland that were emitting an abnormal amount of cortisol. And her ACTH was trying to go down lower and lower and lower in order to turn that off. And because of that, it led to problems in that POMC pathway where there was a weakness of the melanocyte stimulating hormone, which, as I said, regulates our appetite, our weight balance, and our insulin levels.
So, Andrea, take us back and let us know, when did you know something wasn't right with your body?
So I've actually had Cushing's twice for two different reasons, but I assume we're talking about the second one. I would say back in 2015, it started really seriously with constipation. But because I'd had it before, the minute that started, I knew something's wrong. But the first time I was on steroids. And so that is what caused it. I wasn't on any steroids and I hadn't been, and I'd been feeling really good after I had gotten myself off of them. So I didn't connect that maybe it was the same thing. So it started with that, but I was losing weight. So that had been the second factor that had occurred the first time. So I didn't have that right away, but I started to get tired. I think those are probably the two biggest ones. I started to get tired, and then I'd been told I had fibromyalgia, which was the Cushing's in the first one. And so the pain started to come back. So I thought it was Epstein-Barr because I'd had mono, or fibromyalgia. That's why I was so tired. And I thought those were connected with the constipation, but indeed they were not. And then slowly over the 9 years, it was one thing after another started to occur, both internally, that Dr. Cooper would measure and test and scratch her head, and we would both say, I don't know. And she would say, well, we're going to figure this out. And it was also external. Like I started to develop rashes and my face started to get rounder, and I had lost weight. But then when I gained it back, the truncal obesity came, and I have a slight hump in the back of my neck. It's not a large one. Not all of my symptoms are really obvious. So that was how it started.
So originally, Andrea was diagnosed long ago with something called adrenal hyperplasia, which leads to elevated cortisol levels. And so but it's not the same as Cushing's, it's not as full blown. And so a lot of the treatment is to put people on steroids to suppress their adrenal gland function. And so I forgot to mention that putting someone on prednisone is like increasing their cortisol levels artificially. And so that would be the other thing that could lead to like a Cushing-like syndrome, would be being on too much steroid medication, like prednisone, hydrocortisone, dexamethasone, those types of steroids that are used for inflammation and things. But in Andrea's case, she was put on those meds to suppress the adrenal hyperplasia in the past, to calm it down. And then it was like too low, and she just tapered off of that, and everything was fine for a while. And it was actually the last 4 years, I was looking back at your charts there. It was over the last 4 years, especially, that things started not seeming right. I mean, the weight was increasing a lot and the glucose levels were increasing, insulin levels were increasing. And the funny thing is, the cortisol wasn't actually very high. It was more that the ACTH in the brain responder, was very suppressed. And so at first, it was hard to tell if it was a problem where the steroids from the past had suppressed something, or was there actually anything in the adrenal that was emitting extra cortisol that the brain was reacting to? So I think one of the reasons why it's thought to be so rare, like 1 in a million or something, is because it's hard to diagnose. And people with these things tend to walk around with symptoms forever. And Andrea, going to like Epstein-Barr, all these fibromyalgia, all these are sort of like what we call wastebasket diagnoses. Like when you don't know what's wrong, people are given these diagnoses that are not really solid because that's why we call them wastebasket diagnoses. It's like, well, could be that. But I think that being persistent and just always asking why is this like this doesn't make sense? And then you keep tracking it and trying to figure out, and having things looking through that metabolic lens really helps, because you're trying to figure out, why is the metabolism being affected like this? And so that's kind of what led us to do some more testing. And even though it's thought to be very rare, in my practice, I've actually seen other cases like this. So it can't be that it's 1 in a million, because I haven't seen that many patients. But Andrea ended up with treatment for it where she actually had to have surgery to remove the area of her adrenal gland that was secreting the extra cortisol. And I've had other patients too where that happened, where they had Cushing's and had to have that nodule removed from their adrenal gland, or a whole adrenal gland removed. So it can't be as rare. And I think that's why we're here trying to tell the story, is about being suspicious of things that don't add up metabolically. And going that extra step to look further, and why that's just so important.
I think, too, if you don't mind my adding, that doctors tend to look for very specific traits. They look for the stria, they look for the truncal obesity, they look for the moon face, and then they sort of stop there, or maybe they'll check your blood pressure. But unfortunately, for instance, I didn't have the high blood pressure or the Dr. Cooper, you can correct me, but I don't think I started to head towards prediabetes until sort of that last stint, the last couple of years. And the thing that sort of made this a desperate search for me was that about a year ago, I simply couldn't get out of bed. I mean, I would go to work and I would collapse, but I have teenage boys and I couldn't take care of them. And there seemed to be no reason. And the weight was just packing on. So I think they just look for these sort of very obvious symptoms. But if you don't take the blood and you don't ask questions, then I think a lot of people slip through the cracks.
It's true. The other case that I had too didn't fit the typical textbook that I had recently. This was a patient who didn't even have extra body weight, and one of the main symptoms was bruising, because you can get a lot of bruises and things. But the classic symptoms they describe in the textbooks are often not what you actually see in clinical real life. But in the textbook, it's that round face, truncal obesity, which means like your torso, because high cortisol leads to actually elevated weight, and a lot of it's fluid too, in the torso, chest, neck, and face. So there's like the moon face is what it's called, and that buffalo hump, which is the hump on the shoulders, and then dark, like purple stretch marks. That's the classic. I mean, the cases I've seen, which have been few, but more than what they're reporting, have not presented that way typically. So again, it is true. Those would be big red flags, but then looking further to catch when something doesn't make sense, and being in the metabolic realm, that POMC pathway is such an important part of the pathway. That's why we measure, and stress affects, our metabolism so much. That's why we measure cortisol, and we measure ACTH, which are the key hormones in Cushing's.
Andrea, you mentioned stria. What is that?
So stria is a thinning of your skin and it turns purple. It looks like stretch marks, usually behind your arms, behind your knees and on your thighs, and across your stomach is the big one. And so interestingly, the first time with the steroids, I got them and they were severe, but they were eventually removed because your skin thins out so much that it can sometimes burst open. So I didn't actually have the striae this round, and they didn't come back. So, I mean, even that alone is an indication of that's one of the main things they look for. But I had the old ones behind my arms and my legs, but I didn't have the big purple ones. It becomes painful when it becomes really, really thin.
How long was the process from when you first noticed, especially in time 2, when you first noticed something's not right, to when you sort of figured out what was happening?
Well, I can remember the day that I got constipation. I know that sounds really odd, but there was just something about it that I just knew. And that was November of 2015. And that was when I thought, oh, whatever that was that I had before is coming back. I didn't know it was Cushing's the first time. I did, but I didn't realize that it had extended once they took me off the prednisone and put me on hydrocortisone. So I had my surgery on July 9th of this year. So 9 years.
And how many endocrinologists did you see over these years?
If we start from the very beginning, so I came to Seattle when I was 24 years old, and I am 55 now. I would put it in the ballpark of about 40. There was a point where I think I might have seen every single endocrinologist a good 20 years ago. So now we have a new batch that I'm sort of running through. And just this time around, Dr. Cooper, what are we at, 3 or 4, I think? Yeah. And they're supposed to be the ones to help me. But it was Dr. Cooper who found it. And even now when I go to try to get, the hydrocortisone that you have to be on after you have I had a partial adrenalectomy. They don't want to test properly. The titration is just sort of try this, try that. It's very hit or miss, which I'm puzzled by. I sort of want to say, didn't you go to med school for this?
Well, I think it goes back to just the thought that, well, that's rare. You can't possibly have that. And I think you took it in your own hands after we were a little bit frustrated with trying to get this treated locally. You took it in your own hands to go to like a main center in the country for the treatment. You had to go out of state. Yeah. And I think that was a good choice. And then because when something's rare, it's nice to go somewhere where that's all they do. That's all they see from all over the world. And those are the real experts. And so finally getting connected to that, I think really did help.
I think the most interesting thing of going to the Center of Excellence that I went to for my surgery was simply that he wasn't fazed by anything, and he was not a naysayer. As we're talking about all these different symptoms, he just looked at me and said, yeah, you have it. So do a lot of other people around here that don't look like you. And it was just nice to have that, affirmed while I was about to go in there and have my adrenals taken out. It was nice to hear someone say, yes, this is the right place. This is the right thing. And this is what's going to help you. And it did. Within 24 hours, I felt so much better. I mean, I had to get over the pain of them having dug around in my kidneys, but I woke up and I immediately felt less fatigued. The pain, I developed this muscle pain in my legs and my arms, which I guess is also a symptom. You have trouble sometimes. Some people have trouble with yeast infections, and I'd had this horrible one for about 7 years. It went away, and my personality changed. I think this was one of the hardest things for me to deal with while it was happening. Was I was becoming super irritable, and I work with children and super nice people. So I was becoming kind of mean and cranky, and I finally took my medical leave slightly early because I didn't want to sort of splatter this on everyone, but it's affected my family, my children and whatnot, because it really does change your personality. I mean, as Dr. Cooper said, it's a steroid. I'm spewing out steroids all the time, and I'm aggressive and I'm irritable, right?
Mm-hmm. The first time I saw you after surgery, it wasn't even a week, I said, oh my gosh, you're just different. You look different and you sounded different, and it really did seem to help. And all these years we'd been trying to figure out how to help you and what was really the root of it. And just the whole concept that it could take that long, I just was really frustrated and dismayed that you had to go through all that for all those years.
Yeah, and it takes a toll on people's lives and those around them. I mentioned I have 2 teenage sons. I have one who's very angry at me right now because I was so angry and irritable and difficult, and I couldn't tend to them like the mother that they were used to. He's having trouble connecting, all the dots to that. So it takes a toll. And I will be honest, I live in clean squalor because someone comes and doesn't clean, but there's stuff everywhere, and it's taking me all summer to clean it because 10 years of that kind of exhaustion, things just fall away, right? And towards the end, I wasn't eating well. I used to be one of Dr. Cooper's best eaters. And I was getting embarrassed to tell her, no, I haven't done what you asked me to do because I can't. I literally cannot get off of the sofa once I have returned from work. And I would be pushing through it because I had to bring home a paycheck. Because the other thing about this is while you're guessing, it costs a ton of money. You're going here, you're going there, you're trying this, you're trying that, this IV, this injection, this medication, and it wears on your pocketbook. So it took a toll on my family, on everyone that, loves me.
I'd love to learn what you've learned from this experience, Andrea, and also Dr. Cooper. It sounds like something so rare is not something you see all the time. And I mean, when we go to the doctor, I think we all like to just trust what they say, and we go home and we hope that what they said is the truth and it works. But you just went through hell for 9 years. What was the biggest takeaway for you? Well,
for me, it was just reassuring what I've always thought. If something's not adding up, get another opinion. I'm a specialist in metabolism. I'm not actually an endocrinologist or a adrenal Cushing specialist, but just those clues being there and trying to get on board and keep asking questions to the people that can look a little deeper. There's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion, a third opinion, a fourth opinion, whatever it takes. If you still are not satisfied that you've accurately ruled out a condition, even if it is rare. So, and I think that's because a lot of these conditions that are thought to be rare, I've learned over the years, they're definitely not. We see some of them that are reported as being rare are actually almost at an epidemic level even. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's just that we're not testing. We're not testing the population.
I think for me, the amount of perseverance that you have to have and the amount of willingness to just research and read and find out and make connections is immense. And I'm not, a medical practitioner at all, right? I'm a teacher, but I had the skills to be able to research and read and understand, what is critical thinking and what do I need to do for this? Not everybody has that. And so my takeaway was there's a lot of people out there who are probably suffering in the same way I was, who don't have those skills or the knowledge, or even they don't even know where to start. So like me in math class, couldn't figure out where to start. It didn't make any sense. And that seems so sad. And the other thing I think I understand from this, and this does not include Dr. Cooper nor my niece, a lot of the medical professionals don't want to puzzle. They aren't curious. The in and out. And if you don't have the obvious symptoms or whatever it is that they're looking for, then you're just left on your own. And I'm always puzzled by that idea of not wanting to be curious. I mean, here's a chance to do something interesting, to help someone to find out something new. But I didn't see that in the 40 plus endocrinologists that I went to. And they were all lovely people, really, really, they did want what was right for their patient, but they didn't seem to have that desire to be curious.
And in this era of managed care, it seems like the number of patients you see in a day is sort of the metric by which these doctors are measured. So.
Right. And someone such as myself, I'm going to be there longer. I'm not going to be there for 15 minutes. It's going to take a while to figure out what's going on and what labs do we do. But they don't have that time.
I think it has a definite correlation to having metabolic issues that years ago, when you first started going to doctors and saying, I'm on all these diets, but I can't lose weight. What the hell is going on? And doctors would be like, well, you're obviously not doing enough exercise, or you're obviously eating too much food. I feel like what you went through is times a million what a lot of other people who listen to this podcast went through. So it's the perseverance to find the right doctor or the right professionals who will spend the time, because they do only have 15 minutes to talk to you. And I mean, before I worked with Dr. Cooper, no doctor ever tested me for anything. And, they never did a blood test about metabolism. Nobody ever really talked about it except to say, you have a bad metabolism. I mean, that was all they said. And I think that what you did was you persevered times a million to make sure I don't feel right. And I think that part of what we kind of tell people during this podcast is, your body, that something is wrong. That there's something isn't right. You're doing all the right things, but something's not happening. And it's so hard because we do put doctors in this position of like, you're the expert. You went to medical school. You were a resident. You were this. Help me. And when they tell you something and it doesn't work, you feel like you can't help it, but you feel like you failed. And then you have to sort of get up the energy to go to the next one and the next one and the next one. And it is disheartening and it is horrible and it takes such a toll on you.
I would say that that is completely correct and something that I experienced. I would say that recently it has improved slightly. It is not good, but I will give an example of the first round where I went and I was going to boot camp every morning. I was dragging myself out of bed, going to boot camp. And this particular endocrinologist turned to me and said, well, if you quit sitting on the sofa and eating bonbons, you wouldn't have gained so much weight. I gained it really quickly. And then he said, and besides, you couldn't have gained it that quickly. You must have been doing this for a while.
Oh my
Right.
gosh.
And you have to have really a sense of yourself. And like you said, a belief in that you know your body to be up against that. And that was not the first horrible thing that I was told. That was one of the worst, though. And I had to walk out of there and say, no, I'm right. I know something's wrong. And then go find another doctor. And that drains you so much. And it really makes you doubt yourself. And then you have these moments, and well, it would be longer than moments, but there were times where it's just, I can't do this again. You have to gather up the courage and the energy to say, all right, it's another act of courage for me to walk into that doctor's office and hope that they will be kind to me. I mean, even if they can't figure it out, just be kind.
Right. I mean, they tell you all these things that you've done to yourself that you're like, no, I didn't do that.
Right. And I think that's almost crazy making. And I don't use that loosely. It really does make you start to doubt if what you feel and what you see is real. And so then it's almost like children who one thing is happening, but their reality is something else. And they'll tell you, they'll stomp their feet and say, no, this is what's happening. As an adult, we don't tend to have that so much, but you do start to develop that. You start to think, well, am I really gaining weight that rapidly? Am I really eating well? Maybe it's the 3 boot camps I missed this month. And it's not fair to the poor patient who's coming in and trying to just get better.
Right. And you waited probably a month to get that appointment.
Yeah. Back then it was easier. Now it is 3 or 4 months to get to the first endocrinologist after Dr. Cooper said to me, you need to go get a scan. So we got a scan and we saw that there were the adenomas on it. That was in, I believe, maybe October, November. I couldn't get an appointment until March. My first appointment after that was in March. And in that time, it grew a great deal. When they pulled it out, it was a lot bigger than it was during that scan. And that is probably why in that time I gained so much weight, because I gained an extra 20 pounds right before my surgery, as he was telling me to lose weight. And the irritability and the exhaustion, it was almost tenfold in that amount of time.
When we told Dr. Cooper's origin story many episodes ago, it started with Dr. Cooper listening to and believing her patients because the science didn't make sense. I mean, it just didn't make sense at that point. The other thing that's striking me, Dr. Cooper, is that in Western medicine, I think too many of us still look at our bodies as kind of like machines, like our car. Well, the alternator went out, let's go replace it. But what you teach is to really get in tune and have an intuition, like Andrea mentioned earlier, to know your body. So Dr. Cooper, what's your best advice to adjust our mindset to the point where we can become so aware that when something is wrong, we know to take action?
I think it is hard because what I call it physiologic intuition, it's kind of learned. And listening to Andrea explain like how your own reality you start questioning it. That's risky and dangerous for the physiologic intuition because it's sending you those signals and then you're doubting them. So it's easy to drown it out or numb yourself to those signals. But I think it really is valuable to listen to your body and pay attention to what you're feeling and to have confidence that you know your body better than anyone, better than any doctor, better than any dietitian or trainer or so-called expert. And so if something doesn't feel right, you really do have to pursue it. And you do have to have an ally in the mix. And doctors are rushed and they are trying their best. It's a really difficult environment for, healthcare practitioners right now. It's hard for them to really fully be present and be there because of a lot of obstacles in the way in our healthcare system right now, which I could go on forever describing that problem. But it's nice to have an ongoing relationship. Like Andrea and I have had tons of appointments And it's not just once or twice. And so if we didn't address it enough, that one appointment, the next time it's like still there nagging at you. And it's like, that thing is still there, that weird situation. Why is this happening? Why aren't you responding to this? And so having that ongoing continuity with the healthcare provider that believes you and listens to you and gets that key core information from you, because that's the most valuable information you can give a healthcare provider, is what you're feeling and what you're experiencing. If they're the ones that are trying to solve the problems and pursue this investigative medicine approach, well, most of the evidence is going to come from the patient and what they have to tell you. So you need to find someone who's really going to listen, but also understanding it can take time and multiple appointments to get to the root of things. And you have to keep bringing it up and maybe reminding them too of your symptoms.
I think it's really important to have like your primary care physician or one of your doctors be somebody who's an advocate for you and feel like they're on your side, so that when you do encounter a doctor who is not on your side or not on your team, you feel strong enough to fire them. And I know it's like you need to have somebody so that you can tell a friend, fire the doctor, get rid of them, lose them. Because I have so many friends who will go to their doctor and the doctor says something idiotic and ridiculous. And I'll say, lose the doctor. And they're like, well, I can't, I don't know. And I'm like, lose them, drop them like a hot potato. And they're like, I can't. And it's because they don't have anyone else to go to, or they don't know how to, but if they had one other doctor who was an advocate for them, they would feel strong enough to do it. But we hold the doctors in such high esteem, and it's so hard in the healthcare system to do that. But if you have one doctor who's like on your side, you feel strong enough to do it. And I think it's so important.
I would say actually though that some of that hanging on is actually a sign of hope. They hang on in the hope that doctor will help them. So they haven't lost, the belief that they can get better. So,
Like,
I mean, in some ways, it's not the best way to go about it, but I do think sometimes that it is a sign of hope.
It's kind of like hanging on to an ex-boyfriend, though. Like somebody who's really an adult, who's really just a loser.
Well, I suppose it depends what they say, right? Unless you're hanging on to Mr. Quit eating bonbons on the sofa would have been a good
exactly. But they're hanging on to that guy.
I was thinking of a particular swear word when you told the bonbon story. Good grief. Andrea, how do you feel today? How is life?
So I still have good days and bad days. Today's a good day, so I'm going to tackle the house. But about 2 days ago, I went and swam laps. I'm trying to get back in shape. That's the other thing, right? If you sit on a sofa for a year and a half, you have to start all over again. And I laid on the sofa and had a 4-hour nap after my 15 laps, which was better than the week before. And some days I wake up and I'm like, nope, just have to sleep today. So it's good days and bad days, but it's getting better. And the steroids that I have to take until my other adrenal kicks in, it's like your kidneys. You can have one of them and still function. We're working on that. And I can tell almost immediately when I have too much, because those Cushing symptoms come back immediately. I'm on a road forward. It's progressing forward. It's slow though. I mean, I think I gained in the end 70 pounds or something.
Wow.
And and I'm not very tall, and I have to get rid of it for my health's sake. So
that part will be easy once we get the adrenal issue straight. But you still have another adrenal mass on the other adrenal gland, and that's what's also an unknown.
I do. And so we're sort of checking that. But one of the things that I'm really, how am I doing? I'm doing well. I am recovering. But I am also trying to change how I interact with the world. I don't need more stress to have that one all of a sudden, go off as well. And then I'm just being inundated with cortisol. I'm very well aware of what will happen if he has to take that tumor, because this time he tries to leave about 50%, whether it's 10 and 40, 20 and 30. But he had to take so much tissue because that other adenoma had grown so large that he left this other one. I was actually scheduled to have it 2 days ago, the second surgery, but he left it because he wants me to have as much as my natural adrenal tissue as I can have. But knowing what will happen if I lose it has made me look around my world and say, all right, do I really want to fight with my ex-husband about this for the children? They're 18. They can do this. Do I really want to go out and, whatever it is, I have to say, is that going to cause me stress? Is that something I really want to do? Is it worth the cost or the what I'm going to have to pay for that physically? So it has forced me to change things. And it's been a constant in my life as this has progressed. But now that I finally understand, it's easier for me to do. Before it was do this, do that. Well, to what end? We don't even know what I have. Is it going to work? So and it's nice.
Some of that advice is good for everyone about reevaluating your stressors and, learning to say no about stuff and trying to avoid where you can avoid extra stress that we don't need.
Yeah.
Long ago, Dr. Cooper would give out a list of things she wanted you. And I've been her patient, I don't know,
forever.
Since I was a young woman. It's been many years. We get a list of things to do to relax and get your cortisol down. And I still refer to that. I don't have the paper anymore, but I remember very clearly what you told me to do. And so I still tend to that.
Well, she's told me to take nice warm baths every once in a while. So we've all got the list. Andrea, this has been so interesting to hear your story. And gosh, I've learned so many things. As we wrap things up, I'd love to just ask what the takeaways are. Andrea, the other spelling. I know, same spelling.
Same spelling, different
pronunciation. What's your takeaway for this?
I really think that it's about sticking to your guns and knowing your body and knowing when things are wrong and knowing how to manage yourself and manage the system to just keep going. Know that when something's wrong, it's wrong, and that you have the power to sort of work on it to fix it. I spent a long time trying to fix my problem. Andrea has spent even longer trying to fix her problem. And we can work on things for a long time and try and fix ourselves, or not fix ourselves, I guess just make ourselves better. And it's worth it in the end.
Dr. Cooper, what's your takeaway?
Well, it's true what Andrea said. Don't give up. Just keep persevering and listen to your body. And I just think that that's so valuable, and the communication that we talked about with a healthcare provider advocate to try to get to the root of the issues. And if something doesn't add up, there's likely something that's being missed. And so keep looking for that root problem.
Yeah. As I was hearing your story, Andrea, something that hit me was, I think in society, and we all have friends who have more health problems than we do. And I think it's so easy to judge people like, oh, they're that guy that's always sick. He's always sick. And when I'm hearing your story, this is a legitimate condition and you were wiped out. And I think it's really easy to judge people that have chronic health conditions. And I just feel like I've been tapped on the shoulder to offer more grace to people in that situation in life, just to have some compassion. We don't know what other people are experiencing, but at least we can do is listen to them and care about them. So I really appreciate you sharing your story today. This has been so much fun. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me on. I hope that it helps someone out there.
I'm sure it will. And this has been another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.